Have you ever wondered why some people recover from loss better than other people? Right now, you might be suffering from deep loss and you're in heavy grief, and I'm sorry for your loss. I'm Dave Matthews with Spark of Life, and I want to share a story with you today that hopefully can give you some hope to get up and to live forward with your pain and with your loss. I want you to know that grieving deeply is normal and natural when you lose somebody you love or something you love. And perhaps you lost somebody to death, or perhaps you lost a relationship, or perhaps somebody's hurt you really bad in the past. Maybe a spouse left you and you're left all alone and you don't know what to do. Or maybe you haven't talked to your child in 5 years. As I talked to a lady the other day who hadn't talked to her daughter in 5 years. That's a heavy loss as well. Today I want to share with you a story, and at Spark of Life, we walk beside grievers who are experiencing loss and who just need help to discover life again, to discover hope again. Many years ago, I worked for a church when I was in college, a summer job. That's where I met my wife, and I met this couple there that one of these humble couples. They didn't have much money. They lived in a very simple house. They didn't have a fancy car. In fact, he had an old beat-up truck that he had for like 25 years. And he had a good family. He loved his wife. He had a few kids and some grandkids. And I moved away from that town, and Debbie and I got married. Moved away and visited every now and then because that's where our parents were from. And so many years had passed. And then one day we had spent a weekend at the parents' house, and this man's wife, I'm telling you about Bob's wife, had found out we were in town, and she called me, and we were leaving the next day to go home, Debbie and I. And she called me and she said, "David, I hear you're in town." I said, "Yes." And she said, "I guess you've heard about my husband." And I said, "Yes." And he had cancer, and the doctors only gave him a couple of months to live. I had not seen this man in about 5 years. He was in his 80s. And so she said, do you have any time to come see him maybe this afternoon before you guys leave town? He would love to see you. Now, I felt guilty not going to see him, and so I went over there to the house that afternoon to see him. And I came to visit a dying man, and I had a conversation with death. And I want to tell you what happened. As I walked in, he was just as I expected. His false teeth were out. He looked very old. I had not seen him in a few years, but he looked older than I imagined. And he had lost tons of weight with this cancer. He looked like he was dying because he was. I spent about an hour talking to him. That hour has to rank in the top 10 of hours of my life. I put the birth of our children and marriage to my wife and all that, up there. But this hour ranks in the Hall of Fame hours for me, because it actually changed my life. I went to encourage him in his walk with death, and he encouraged me in my walk with life. And it's funny how those two things are connected, isn't it? So he's dying. I go in there. His wife leaves us alone, and he starts talking. I said, "Bob, tell me about what you're experiencing and what you're thinking. And I'm so sorry to hear about this cancer." And he said, "Thank you for that." And then for the next 50 minutes or so, he talked and I listened. If you know anything about me, you know me not talking for 50 minutes is like the eclipse of the sun that happens about as often, right? And for 50 minutes he talked. I didn't say a word, because I didn't want to say anything. I was listening to life words. You know what he didn't talk about? He didn't talk about how he had been harmed in life, how people had taken advantage of him, how some of his friends had betrayed him. He didn't talk about how he had been mistreated at work or the bad breaks he had. He never talked about the bad break of cancer, even though he didn't like it. And he was battling it. He didn't like it one bit, but he never talked about the unfairness of it all. Even though he might have thought that, talked about it earlier, he didn't talk about it that night. He didn't talk about how he didn't make enough money to ever get new carpet for his house. He didn't talk about how his wife had mistreated him. He didn't talk about how his kids left the tools out and ruined them when they were young. He didn't talk about any of that crap. You know what he talked about? Yeah, you know what he talked about. He talked about the people in his life he was grateful for. He started with his wife. His wife, he told me, she had been sick, David. She had been so sick she could hardly get out of bed. And we came back from the doctors, and they told us I only had a few months to live. And you know, my wife suddenly got better, and she started waiting on me and serving me, and here she wasn't feeling good. David, I'm so grateful for a good wife. Never take your wife for granted, he said. I'm so grateful for her. He talked about her and the good times they had had and the good friends that they had and the great jobs they had had, even though he didn't have much money. He didn't have much money at all. He didn't talk about how he envied the rich. No, he talked about how he was grateful for his wife. And then he talked about his children. And he named each child first name, middle name, last name. He talked about their accomplishments. He talked about what good kids they were. He talked about how proud he was of them. And he just beamed as he talked about his children. Then he talked about his grandchildren. Well, the smile turned to a big old beam when he talked about his grandkids. And he named them first name, middle name, last name, one after the other in the correct age of their birth, I guess, because he told me their ages. And he went to the oldest to the youngest. And he talked with how grateful he was for their health and how grateful he was for that. And I found out some of his kids had grandkids, one or two had real health problems. But he talked with pride about each one of them. And I was about to leave, and before he let me go, he said, Dave, before you go, I got to tell you about one more. He's our only great-grandchild. Do you know I had a great-grandchild? And I said, Bob, I didn't know that. And he talked about, I think the kid's name was Dusty. And he was 3 years of age at that time, and you would think this kid had become president of the United States. You'd think he was the most famous person in the world. He talked about Dusty with as much pride and love and gratitude as I can imagine, as you can imagine. He talked about all the good things of his life, and it ended with Dusty. And Dusty had a spark of life all over him. He showed me a picture of his only great-grandchild. And I promise you, it looked like his great-grandfather, because that kid had life in his eyes. And I hugged him for the last time. He died about a month later. And when I left and I got my wife and I told her all about it, we drove home to see our kids. And we finally got home. We hadn't seen them in a few days. You know what I did? I spent more time with my kids. I said more prayers to my God. I hugged my wife better, longer. I was thankful for her more. I was thankful for all the good things in my life and not all the bad things that had happened. I remember thinking about life in a new way. And I had a talk with death, and life had showed up. I had visited a dying man and talked to him for an hour. And because of his spirit and his gratitude, I went back more alive than ever before. It shocked me, really. I didn't understand gratitude till that day. I often wonder why I'm not more grateful for what I have. And if you're grieving right now, you have every right to grieve. And grief is normal and natural, and it will throw you to the mat. And sometimes you give up. And you think you'll never be happy again. And you think you'll never have joy again. And I know that's natural and normal, but I don't want you to stay there. I want you to visit there. I want you to be there, because we grieve because we love, right? No, I'm not trying to talk you out of your grief. What I want you to add to your grief experience is a little bit of life. I want to encourage you to be grateful. How do I be grateful? I want you to write down one thing you're grateful for. Just one thing. Write it down. Take 10 seconds. And every day when you get up or when you go to bed, just write down one grateful thing in your life. See what it does to your grief walk. All the studies about the brain and gratitude show us that gratitude expressed on a simple daily basis can end up changing the way your brain is wired and changing the way you process information and changing negative emotions to positive. You can read all the studies you want, but until you actually do it, those studies don't mean anything. So write down one thing you're grateful for today. You can go a little further. You could even text somebody you're grateful for and encourage their day. It don't take more than a minute to do it. Do it under a minute every day. One person a day, one grateful thought a day, one encouraging word to somebody you're grateful for a day. Keep it simple and see if your grief can have a little hope mixed with it. And a little more hope every day, and you'll experience living forward with your grief and not just existing forward. I had a visit with death, and life showed up. Grab hope today. Spark a life. We believe there's always hope.